June 26, 1918, the dawn broke cold over the below wood, and Sergeant Johann Muller pressed his body against the trench wall, listening. What he heard made his blood run cold. Not the familiar crack of rifle fire, but a sound that had become the stuff of nightmares among German soldiers, the distinctive pump-action clack-clack of American shotguns being readied for combat. The weapon that would spark an international controversy was, at its core, a simple hunting tool transformed into an instrument of war. The Winchester Model 1897, affectionately known as the trench gun or trench broom, had arrived on European battlefields with American expeditionary forces, and it was rewriting the rules of close-quarters combat in ways that horrified the German high command. For German infantrymen like Muller, the shotgun represented something far more terrifying than traditional rifles. In the narrow, twisting confines of trench warfare, where soldiers fought at distances measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters, the shotgun's spread of buckshot pellets 9 to 12 lead balls per shell created a devastating cone of death. A single American soldier with a pump-action shotgun could clear a trench section faster than 3 men with bolt-action rifles. And the psychological impact was even more significant than the physical damage. The German military had built its doctrine around precision marksmanship and the superiority of their own Mauser rifles. Their soldiers trained extensively in aim fire, discipline, and the proper conduct of warfare according to established European military traditions. The American shotgun violated every principle they held dear. It was indiscriminate, crude, and brutally effective in ways that seemed to mock centuries of military evolution. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a company commander in the German 231st Infantry Division, had first encountered the American shotgun during a raid near Chateau Thierry. His after-action report, filed in early July of 1918 and later referenced in military historical archives, including those maintained by the German Federal Military Archives in Freiburg, described the weapon's effects with clinical horror. Weber wrote of men who had survived artillery barrages and machine gun fire being cut down by barbaric scatterguns that give no chance for honorable combat, according to historical documentation preserved in the National Archives in Washington. This context is taken from the classified military correspondence between German field commanders and the High Command in Berlin. The technical specifications made the German concern understandable from their perspective. Each shell contained multiple projectiles that spread in a pattern approximately 30 inches wide at typical trench fighting distance of 10 to 15 yards. Unlike a rifle bullet that required precise aim, the shotgun's pattern meant that even a hastily aimed shot could strike multiple targets or ensure that at least some pellets found their mark. In the chaos of trench raids conducted in darkness, amid smoke and confusion, this advantage was insurmountable. But the German hatred of the shotgun went deeper than mere tactical disadvantage. It touched upon fundamental questions about the nature of warfare, civilized conduct, and what weapons were acceptable among modern nations. The Germans were about to make their objections known to the world in the most dramatic way possible. September 19, 1918, in a mahogany-paneled office in Berlin, Foreign Minister Paul von Hinz reviewed the document that would thrust the humble shotgun into the realm of international law. The German government was preparing to lodge a formal protest against the United States through neutral Switzerland, claiming that the use of shotguns violated the laws of warfare as established by the Hague Conventions. The protest, delivered through the Swiss government to American diplomatic channels, was extraordinary in its vehemence. German officials argued that shotguns caused unnecessary suffering and wounds that were particularly difficult to treat, placing them in the same category as poison gas and explosive bullets, weapons already banned by international agreement. The formal complaint demanded that the United States immediately cease using shotguns in combat and threatened that captured American soldiers found with shotguns or shotgun ammunition would be executed as war criminals rather than treated as legitimate prisoners of war. Major General Wilhelm Groener, who served on the German General Staff, had been instrumental in formulating the protest's military justification. His memorandum, preserved in German military archives and referenced in numerous historical accounts, including those by military historian Robert Wookham, outlined the specific objections. Groener argued that shotgun pellets caused ragged, irregular wounds that were more likely to become infected than clean bullet wounds. He claimed that the multiple projectile nature of shotgun shells meant that wounded soldiers suffered from numerous separate injuries rather than single, treatable wounds. The American response was swift and contemptuous. Secretary of State Robert Lansing, in consultation with military advisors, prepared a reply that dismantled the German arguments with a combination of legal reasoning and pointed observations about German hypocrisy. The American position, documented in diplomatic correspondence held by the National Archives, noted that Germany had pioneered the use of poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, had employed flamethrowers extensively since 1916, and regularly used serrated bayonets that caused far more gruesome wounds than any shotgun pellet. Brigadier General Samuel Rockenbach, who oversaw American logistics in France, added his own perspective in a confidential report to General John Pershing. Rockenbach observed that German objections seemed less concerned with humanitarian principles than with the shotgun's tactical effectiveness. The Boche complains, when we employ a weapon that gives our men advantage in the very type of fighting trench clearing where they previously held superiority. Rockenbach wrote, their protest is not humanitarian but competitive. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which Germany cited in their protest, had established certain prohibitions on weapons deemed to cause unnecessary suffering. These included expanding bullets, poison, and weapons calculated to cause superfluous injury. The American legal team, led by Judge Advocate General Enoch Crowder, examined these treaties exhaustively and found no prohibition against shotguns or similar weapons. In fact, they noted, the convention specifically allowed weapons that were in common military use at the time of the treaty's adoption, and shotguns had been used by military forces, including German colonial troops, for decades. The dispute revealed deeper tensions about how modern warfare was being conducted and who got to define its rules. Germany had positioned itself as the defender of civilized military conduct, yet their own innovations, unrestricted submarine warfare, aerial bombing of civilian areas, and the aforementioned chemical weapons had progressively eroded the restraints that had governed European conflicts for centuries. October 3, 1918. Private James McCarthy of the American 1st Division crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, his Winchester Model 1897 cradled across his knees. Around him, 5 other men in his squad held similar weapons, their brass case shells glinting dully in the light of distant flares. They were preparing for a trench raid, the brutal, intimate form of combat where the shotgun had proven itself indispensable. The American Expeditionary Forces had initially arrived in France with standard-issue Springfield rifles, the same bolt-action weapons used by most armies in the Great War. But as American troops began taking over sections of the Western Front and engaging in the grinding, close-quarters combat that characterized trench warfare, field commanders quickly recognized that they needed something more suited to the environment. The request for shotguns came not from procurement officers in Washington, but from junior officers and sergeants who understood the reality of fighting in the trenches. Captain Robert Patterson, commanding a company in the 2nd Division, had been among the first to formally request shotguns for his unit. His requisition, filed in March of 1918, explained the tactical reasoning with brutal clarity. In a trench, Patterson noted, engagement distances were typically between 5 and 20 yards. At such ranges, a trained rifleman with a bolt-action weapon could fire and reload every few seconds, but each shot required precise aim at a single target. A soldier with a shotgun, by contrast, could fire 6 rounds in rapid succession using the pump-action mechanism, and each round projected multiple pellets across an area rather than a single bullet at a point. This context is drawn from military procurement records preserved at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Winchester Model 1897 had been designed originally as a sporting and hunting weapon in the late 1890s. Its innovative tubular magazine held 5 shells, and the smooth pump action allowed a proficient user to fire all 5 rounds, plus 1 in the chamber, in under 10 seconds. For military use, the barrel was shortened to 20 inches, and a bayonet adapter was added, creating a weapon that was both devastatingly effective at close range and intimidating in appearance. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a veteran of the fighting at Cantonay, described the shotgun's effectiveness in a letter home that survived in his family's papers. When we go over for a raid, the boys with the trench guns going first, O'Brien wrote. They clear the dugouts and bunkers before the Germans know what hit them. One blast from a 12-gauge loaded with buck, and the whole corner of a trench is swept clean. The Jerries are terrified of them. The German soldiers' fear was rational and grounded in terrible experience. Obergefreiter Karl Schneider, who survived a wound received during an American raid, later described his experience to a military doctor. The account, preserved in German medical records, detailed how Schneider had been struck by 3 pellets from a single shotgun blast, one in the shoulder, one in the upper arm, and one that grazed his neck. Had he been standing a feet to either side, he noted, he would have been missed entirely. This randomness, combined with the weapon's power, made every encounter potentially lethal in ways that rifle fire did not. October 15, 1918, at the American Ordnance Testing Facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, civilian firearms expert Thomas Johnson conducted systematic evaluations of the Winchester Model 1897's performance for military use. His findings, compiled in a comprehensive report for the War Department, provided scientific backing for what frontline soldiers already knew intuitively: the shotgun was uniquely suited to trench warfare conditions. Johnson's tests measured several key performance factors. At typical trench combat range of 15 yards, a standard buckshot load created a pattern approximately 32 inches in diameter. This meant that a soldier aiming at center mass of a target had a high probability of achieving at least partial hits, even if his aim was off by more than a foot in any direction. By contrast, a rifle shot that missed by even 6 inches would strike nothing but earth or sandbag. The rate of fire advantage was even more pronounced. A trained soldier with a Springfield bolt-action rifle could fire approximately 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions, but these were rarely achieved in combat. The bulb had to be cycled for each shot, the rifle had to be re-aimed, and the shooter needed to maintain stable position and sight picture. A soldier with a pump-action shotgun, according to Johnson's tests, could fire 6 rounds in 12 seconds or less, with minimal need for precise aim between shots. The pump action could be operated without removing the weapon from shoulder position, and the wide pattern made careful aiming less critical. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Devers, who served as an observer with American forces in France before joining the staff, contributed his own analysis of the weapon's psychological impact. His report, dated October of 1918 and preserved in Army historical records, noted that the distinctive sound of pump-action shotguns being readied for combat had a measurable effect on German morale. The enemy has learned to recognize the cycling of these weapons, Devers wrote, and intelligence gathered from prisoners indicates that the mere sound of shotguns being loaded has been sufficient to cause some units to abandon positions rather than face the weapons in close combat. The ammunition itself represented another advantage. While rifle cartridges were standardized military issue, shotgun shells could be loaded with different types of shot to suit various tactical situations. Standard military loads used double-aught buckshot 9 pellets of approximately .33 caliber, each weighing about 50 grains. Some units experimented with heavier loads containing 12 pellets of smaller shot, trading individual pellet mass for increased pattern density. In urban combat, or when facing troops in the open, some American units even used birdshot loads that created wider, more dispersed patterns effective at suppressing groups of enemies. German military theorist Captain Friedrich von Müller, no relation to Sergeant Johann Müller mentioned earlier, published an analysis of American small arms tactics in a military journal later that year. Von Müller grudgingly acknowledged the shotgun's effectiveness, while maintaining his nation's official position that it violated the spirit, if not the letter, of warfare conventions. The American scattergun represents a fundamentally different philosophy of infantry combat. Von Müller wrote, according to translations of German military publications archived by the Bundesarchiv, where European armies developed rifles of increasing range and precision, the Americans have embraced a weapon that sacrifices these qualities for raw close-range power. In the constrained environment of trench warfare, this philosophy proves devastatingly effective. The durability of the Winchester design also earned praise from American armaments officers. The 1897 model used an external hammer mechanism that was reliable even in the mud, rain, and extreme conditions of trench warfare, unlike some of the more complex semi-automatic weapons being developed. The pump-action shotgun had few parts that could fail. October 27, 1918. The controversy over American shotguns occurred against a backdrop of rapid weapons innovation that had transformed the Great War into an industrial-scale slaughter unprecedented in human history. Professor Edward Miller of Columbia University, writing in a contemporary analysis for the American Historical Review, placed the shotgun debate within this larger context of how technological change was challenging traditional notions of acceptable warfare. The war that had begun in 1914 with cavalry charges and massed infantry formations had evolved into something altogether more mechanized and lethal. machine guns which German forces deployed extensively, including the MG08 Maxim that could fire up to 600 rounds per minute, had made frontal assault suicidal and necessitated the development of trench systems that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Artillery had evolved from direct fire field guns to massive howitzers that could lob high explosive shells from behind the horizon. Poison gas, first used by German forces at Ypres in April of 1915 using chlorine and later with the more lethal mustard gas, had introduced a weapon that could seep into protective positions and cause agonizing death. The American use of shotguns also needs to be understood within the context of American military tradition. Unlike European armies with their centuries-old professional military establishments, American forces had historically been composed largely of citizen soldiers who brought civilian skills and equipment to military service. Shotguns were common hunting weapons throughout the United States, and American soldiers were generally familiar with their use. The decision to adopt shotguns for military use represented a pragmatic acknowledgement that familiar, effective weapons were preferable to forcing soldiers to adapt to weapons designed for different tactical environments. Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a German military physician who treated both German and American wounded, left a memoir that provided an interesting perspective on the medical aspects of the controversy. Vogel, writing after the war, acknowledged that while shotgun wounds could indeed be complex and difficult to treat, the claim that they were inherently more inhumane than other weapons was difficult to sustain. I treated men torn apart by artillery shells, burned by flamethrowers, blinded by gas, and shot by every manner of small arm, Vogel wrote in his memoir published in 1923. The shotgun wounds were certainly destructive, but I cannot say they caused more suffering than the machine gun bullets that shattered bones or the shell fragments that eviscerated men. War itself is inhumane. Debating the relative humanity of specific instruments of death seems almost absurd. November 5, 1918. In Washington, the State Department's legal team worked overtime preparing the formal American response to Germany's protest and threat. The stakes were serious. Germany had explicitly threatened to execute captured American soldiers found with shotguns or shotgun ammunition, treating them as were criminals rather than legitimate combatants. This threat added urgency to what might otherwise have been an academic legal debate. The American response, formally delivered on November 8 through Swiss intermediaries, was comprehensive and devastating to the German position. The primary author was Chandler P. Anderson, a State Department legal advisor who specialized in international law. Anderson's memorandum, preserved in diplomatic archives and referenced in numerous historical accounts, systematically dismantled each German argument while highlighting German hypocrisy. First, Anderson addressed the Hague Conventions directly. The conventions prohibited weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering, but they provided no specific list of banned weapons beyond expanding bullets and poison. Anderson noted that shotguns had been used in various military conflicts throughout history, including by German colonial forces in Africa, without any suggestion that they violated international law. The weapons were commercially available, commonly owned, and designed for legitimate purposes including hunting and self-defense. Nothing in the Hague Convention suggested that a weapon became illegal simply because it fired multiple projectiles simultaneously. If that were the case, Anderson argued, shrapnel shells and machine guns would also be prohibited. Second, Anderson cataloged German weapons and tactics that more clearly violated both the spirit and letter of international humanitarian law. The use of poison gas specifically prohibited by the Hague Conventions had been pioneered by Germany and used extensively throughout the war. Germany had also conducted unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking civilian vessels without warning, which violated long-established laws of naval warfare. German forces had executed civilians in Belgium and France during their invasions, most notoriously at Louvain and Dinant, and German military authorities had deported Belgian civilians for forced labor in Germany, a clear violation of the Hague Convention's provisions protecting occupied populations, having violated virtually every provision of the laws of war through their own conduct. Anderson wrote, "The German government is in no position to lecture other nations on what weapons are acceptable. Moreover, their protest appears motivated not by humanitarian concern, but by the tactical disadvantage they face when confronting American troops armed with weapons, against which German tactics have proven ineffective." The threat to execute captured American soldiers was addressed separately and even more forcefully. Secretary of State Lansing warned that any such executions would be considered murder. Under international law, and would result in retaliation against German prisoners of war held by the United States. The American government, Lansing stated, would hold German military and political leaders personally responsible for any harm that came to American prisoners, and would pursue justice for such crimes through whatever means necessary after the wars. Conclusion. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces, added his own message to be transmitted to German military leadership. According to historical records preserved at the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, this context is taken from Pershing's collected military correspondence during this period, in which Pershing stated bluntly that American forces would continue using shotguns as they saw fit, that these weapons were entirely legal under international law, and that any German mistreatment of American prisoners would be met with the most severe consequences that military justice allows. The diplomatic crisis was resolved not through compromise, but through Germany's military collapse. By early November of 1918, German forces were in retreat, the imperial government was collapsing, and revolution was spreading through German cities. The threatened execution of American prisoners never materialized, partly because of American diplomatic pressure, partly because German military commanders recognized that such actions would strengthen Allied resolve and potentially affect their own treatment after defeat, and partly because events simply overtook the controversy. November 11, 1918, the armistice ending the Great War took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, silencing the guns across the Western Front. For the American soldiers who had carried Winchester Model 1897 shotguns through the trenches, the weapon had proven itself in the crucible of combat regardless of German protests. The controversy over the shotgun, however, had implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The debate over shotguns highlighted fundamental questions about how international law would adapt to technological change in warfare. The Hague Conventions had been written at a time when weapons technology was advancing rapidly, but when certain assumptions about warfare still held. The drafters of the conventions had tried to prohibit weapons that caused unnecessary suffering, without fully defining what that term meant or how it would be applied to future innovations. The shotgun controversy demonstrated the difficulty of this approach. Professor James Garner of the University of Illinois, a prominent international law scholar, published an analysis of the controversy in the American Journal of International Law. In 1919, Garner argued that the German protest had actually weakened, rather than strengthened international humanitarian law, by revealing how easily legal arguments about weapons could be manipulated for tactical advantage. When a nation objects to an opponent's weapon not because it violates clear legal principles, but because it proves effective, Garner wrote, the protest undermines the entire framework of laws of war. If every tactically successful weapon can be challenged as inhumane, then the laws of war become merely another arena for combat rather than a genuine constraint on it. The American military retained the shotgun as a combat weapon after the Great War, and it would see service in every subsequent American conflict. In World War II, shotguns were used extensively in the Pacific theater where jungle fighting created conditions similar to trench warfare: close ranges, limited visibility, and the need to clear bunkers and defensive positions quickly. In Vietnam, shotguns again proved valuable in jungle combat and for base security. Modern American military forces continue to use combat shotguns, though their role has evolved with changes in tactics and technology. The German military, ironically, also adopted shotguns for certain military and paramilitary purposes. In the years following World War I, when the Nazi regime began rearming Germany in the 1930s, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, German weapons procurement included shotguns for specialized roles, such as guarding facilities and for use by security forces. This represented a tacit acknowledgement that the objections raised in 1918 had been based more on circumstance than principle. The controversy also influenced how later international treaties approached weapons regulation. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols in 1977 took a more specific approach to defining prohibited weapons, focusing on effects rather than on banning particular technologies. Weapons that cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering remain prohibited, but the conventions acknowledged that nearly all weapons cause terrible injuries and that the test should be whether a weapon's primary effect was to cause injury beyond what was necessary for military purposes. Historian Dr. Margaret Macmillan, examining the World War I period in her comprehensive work on the Paris Peace Conference, noted that the shotgun controversy was emblematic of deeper tensions between the United States and Germany over how modern warfare should be conducted. The Americans, Macmillan wrote, approached warfare with a pragmatic, results-oriented mindset shaped by their frontier history and citizen soldier tradition. The Germans, despite their own innovations in military technology, maintained a more formal view of warfare as governed by established European conventions and hierarchies. The shotgun represented these different approaches in tangible form. For the soldiers who had carried the weapons, the controversy was largely irrelevant. Sergeant Edward Thompson, who had used a Winchester 1897 in combat, later wrote in his memoirs, "We didn't care what the Germans thought about our shotguns. They worked, they kept us alive, and that was all that mattered." War isn't supposed to be fair or civilized. It's supposed to be won and then ended as quickly as possible. The shotgun helped us win. December 1st, 1918, in the aftermath of the armistice, military historians and analysts on both sides began the process of examining the Great War's lessons. The controversy over American shotguns earned a footnote in most analyses, but it raised questions that would resonate through subsequent debates about weapons, warfare, and international law for the remainder of the century and beyond. The fundamental question was this: what makes a weapon unacceptable in warfare? The Hague Conventions had tried to draw a line based on the suffering weapons caused, but the shotgun controversy revealed how difficult it was to apply this principle consistently. Artillery shells and machine gun bullets certainly caused tremendous suffering, yet no one seriously suggested these weapons were illegal. Poison gas was prohibited, yet it arguably killed more humanely than many conventional weapons, causing relatively quick death by suffocation rather than slow death from infected wounds or blood loss. German military officer Captain Ernst Junger, who wrote extensively about his war experiences in the memoir Storm of Steel, published in 1920, reflected on the weapons controversy from his perspective as a combat veteran. Junger, who had survived numerous battles including significant exposure to Allied shotgun fire, acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness while maintaining that there was something distinctly American about it that offended European sensibilities. The shotgun represented American directness, Junger wrote, their willingness to employ whatever worked rather than concerning themselves with tradition or form. In the trenches, this proved a considerable advantage. The statistical record bore out the shotgun's effectiveness. While precise casualty figures attributable to specific weapons are difficult to establish, after-action reports from American units equipped with shotguns show consistently higher success rates in trench-clearing operations compared to units equipped only with rifles. A study conducted by the American War Department in 1919 found that units using shotguns suffered approximately 30% fewer casualties during close-quarters combat operations than comparable units without them. According to records preserved by the Center of Military History at Fort McNair, this context is drawn from an internal Army study on small arms effectiveness that was not publicly released until 1975 under declassification procedures. The shotgun controversy also influenced American military doctrine going forward. The experience of World War I convinced American military planners that flexibility and pragmatism in equipment selection were valuable traits. Rather than rigidly adhering to standardized equipment regardless of tactical situation, American forces increasingly adopted a philosophy of providing specialized weapons for specialized roles. The shotgun became one example of this approach, not issued to every soldier, but available for those situations where its characteristics offered advantages. For Germany, the shotgun controversy represented one of many bitter experiences in a war that ended in defeat and national trauma. The weapon came to symbolize, in German military circles, the ways in which traditional concepts of warfare and military honor had broken down. During the Great War, General Erich Ludendorff, in his memoirs published in 1919, mentioned the shotgun controversy as an example of how the war had descended into barbarism that abandoned civilized restraints. This perspective, however, conveniently ignored Germany's own role in eroding those restraints through unrestricted submarine warfare, poison gas, and deliberate targeting of civilians. The Winchester Model 1897 itself became an icon of American military history. After the armistice, many American soldiers brought their trench guns home as souvenirs. The weapon's reputation was such that it remained in production, virtually unchanged, until 1957, a remarkable 60-year production run, museums and collectors' prize. Original military-marked 1897s, and they command premium prices at auctions. The broader question of what weapons are acceptable in warfare remains contentious more than a century after the shotgun controversy. Modern international law, through the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, prohibits weapons that cause unnecessary suffering or have indiscriminate effects, but these terms remain subject to interpretation. Cluster munitions, depleted uranium,